Alrighty, so I've decided I'm going to redo this video, which is the first video just talking about the requirements for DevelopIT 2. Okay, so and the reason is I'd forgotten, and I'll remove this text that's on here. I forgot to include loops and arrays. Way important in this section, and honestly, because it was such a short introduction to loops, I think that's why I missed it. But no big deal. It was a good opportunity for me to take my code that I had already done, and that's really what I'm talking about here, is really take your code that you wrote for your DevelopIT 1 and then refactor it with these new requirements, right? So you're going to use the code styling and program functionality of objects, arrays, methods, and refactor your code from DevelopIT 1. Right? Even if you have more advanced knowledge of JS, don't use it. Only confine yourself to these 4 sections. Okay? So, and I'm going to give you a little flexibility here. And the reason I say this is for your more simple calculation, you can use you need to have at least 1 object, 1 array, and 2 methods. And then for your more app-like idea, I want 2. And these are, and they may sound somewhat arbitrary, but it's just a level of complexity I want to see at minimum. 2 objects, 1 array, 1 loop, and in this case I didn't put a loop up here, and at least 2 methods per object, right? And then you need to, in this case, do 2 new outputs that you haven't done that advances your idea of your app, right? And so I've left this in here because in both I want you to use a return value from 1 method and invoking the second method. I said month and it should be method, right? And then in this case put it under dev2, under the dev folder we've already done. And then and here's the code review. So this I talked about, so just a brief overview here is if we look at the schedule, right? And this is so important, is you want to do this code review the week before it's actually due. And that gives you a chance to change anything that you may have gotten on your code that you needed to fix. So just because it's worth chatting about for a second here as we move, and I'm doing this obviously a little bit early. I'm actually here on the 17th today doing this. But let's move, let's see, learn together, 6, so 7, so here it is. So it's actually October 1st. So what I would hope to see is starting sometime maybe midweek, and maybe sooner depending on your schedule, that you would have had this done and you're ready for me to do a code review. And if not, then you've come in to at least talk to me about what you have so far, and maybe it's not a full code review, but it's a review of the requirements based on the code that you wrote. But hopefully I will see you sometime this week. And remember, you need to submit your code into the Canvas assignment, which means you have to push your code to your private repo in order for me, and you need to do it within 24 hours. Do it 24 hours before at the time you set up an appointment with me. Make sure that code's in there. And the reason is it gives me a little more time based on my schedule to figure out, give me a little more time to look at your code. And I'm going to say this again, the reason I set no item for this week on Thursday is to give you more time, right, to do this. But so just plan ahead, and I think most of you will based on our discussion of why it's important. But if for some reason not, then you're making sure you submit that DevelopIT 2, and then you have a week to do that code review. Okay, so there's really nothing new on this except that I want to emphasize the timing again, making sure that that you've submitted your code, that you understand the best time to come see me. And as I've said before, right, DevelopIT 1 resubmission, I talked about it in week 6, so you can do it before you do your DevelopIT 2, but if you want to at the same time, if you've modified or updated and fixed the issues we talked about, and you want to get those points back, and in this case for full points, and this is probably something I wouldn't do in the future because I really want you to nail these things, because as you get these concepts, then it just builds upon itself. Okay, so now let me just move over. I ended up, and this is why I was talking about before some flexibility, is I ended up taking the one I thought was a little more simple and making it one that would be more involved, because honestly the more time I spent on it, it was a little more fun. So I actually still need to work on the more simpler one, which at this point should be simpler. But so if you remember my energy before, my energy function that I had, is I ended up then changing this to where I have an energy object that represents just some basic data about my house. And this is not my address, just some basic made up data. And then my daily kilowatt then is per day. The date is how much kilowatts it's used. And then I have a monthly and a monthly kilowatt and cost. And so here I have an add to monthly total where I'm taking in a cost, a kilowatt, and a date. And then I take this total and I add to that cost date, I add to that kilowatt, and then I end up pushing, right? So because this is an array, right? So we're pushing that date and the kilowatt onto that daily kilowatt array. So that's my requirement for an array, right? Or my part of the requirement is to have. So I actually need to have, and I do, actually that is the other thing I need to do, is I actually need to build another array. Is that what I said? See, I have to look at my own requirements. No, I just said one loop, so it's okay. So it's just kind of minimum requirements, I suppose, here. So then I have another method, and I'll show you how these logically run in a minute, that does a show daily. So then it just iterates over this array, right, by getting the length. And in this case, because of the way the data is pushed into the array, I'm actually going to iterate over I'm iterating a +2 instead of a ++, and that gives me the ability to grab, because when I'm pushing it into the array, you can see this is the 0 index, this is the first, so this is the second. So that gives me the ability in one line to grab this value and this value, and I don't have to loop over it as many times. So then I'm building a string array, based on the looping, and then I return that. Okay. So then what I decided to do, and this is really where, you know, when I had done this before, I hadn't done this before. I decided to add this and then keep my temperature preference. Remember the idea that if I wanted to achieve a particular temperature best sleeping for, then I pulled that out into a new object. And in this case, I realized after doing it, I could still refactor here, because I could pull some information like I have here up into the properties, and that's a good way of actually using that, so that way if I ever wanted to change that logic I could. But for now, I just decided to take mostly the code I had written here. So then what I did is I just ran some console logs over the talked about how much my monthly kilowatt hours, and basically I'm just reaching in and displaying these pieces of data here, right? And this just gives some verbiage too, right? And then this gives that, and then I show the detail, right? So this is where I'm iterating over. And then I set up my temperature preference kilowatt based on the temperature outside, temperature inside, and a factor, a kilowatt factor. And then I determine a cost based on passing. And again, this is no different than what I did last time, except I changed the names to make them a little simpler. So once I got that kilowatt cost, then I passed it to this method called my temperature preference, which is here, right? So that method called cost, right? So that, and then I passed in there to then get an actual cost, right? And then I output some information to show, okay, now that you have achieved this temperature, right, this will be your cost. And then what I did is I took that resulting data and then I ran a method on my first object here, right, so that I could see by adding to monthly, I passed in, because I could have just ran my energy with numbers that I had made up, that the idea of posting to that, but I could do this again. Like this would be totally fine in my scenario, is instead of actually using the results of here, although I want you to do that, I could have also just said, let's see, there's like a 4 kilowatt and then my my cost, right? Because the reason I like using the other one, it actually determines an actual number based on some data, but I could, you know, make up some data here as well. And then let's see if I got that right. Just looking at why in this case. Oh, forgot that. Right? So, but I like the idea of actually using data from my other object. And then I run again the same thing I ran at the top just to show the new information. So if I run it, right, I can see the output first of, let me just scroll it down a little bit, make it clear so you can see this, right, and pull this up just a little bit so you can see the whole thing. So then current monthly kilowatts 15, the monthly cost is 120, and then here's the detail, right? And then I did the preference, right, and then added it to the monthly. And then I had an updated monthly. And actually here I actually didn't say anything about this one. So in this case I've added, you can see that then this one, so this one is a result of the calling the method on the my energy, I'm sorry, on the my preference, and getting back that data and then passing it. And this one is just calling it directly, right? So what I liked about this was that it was the idea of just logically what would I add. What would also from an app perspective make sense is that if somebody would want to track their energy, right? And then they'd probably want to know, based on some of my preferences, how would that affect my energy costs? And then would I want to just post those? Because now that I have some actual data as based on my preferences, I could just post that into my app. But you know, if we were really getting realistic, probably if we were really doing this app for real, we'd probably be pulling this data just off of your meter. But again, these don't necessarily have to represent actual working things, but the closer you get to it, the more these things are going to be useful, right? So you're kind of just making your idea mold to the requirements, but the more you think about it and the more work you do on your code to actually make this represent something real, you know, the more fun it's going to be and the more you're going to learn. It's going to really stretch you, right? Okay, so that's my code, and then like I said, I will do my actually end up doing my other one as well. But I just wanted to give you this as a replacement since I didn't cover two really important topics there. All right, hope this helps.